Hello and welcome to the second of 3 training videos. This one today is predominantly going to focus on the process of data collection using ripple effects mapping. The training here really is to accompany the paper that was published in BMC Medical Research Methodology in 2022. Within that you can find additional in-depth information and all being well these videos will provide some alternative content to what is included within the paper. There are a few things that we hope you will be able to go away with from the session today. The first is how to prepare for a ripple effects mapping workshop. Then we're going to go on and look at, well, how do we actually go about delivering a ripple effects mapping workshop? There's also the opportunity to run follow-up sessions rather than just seeing ripple effects mapping as something that is done as a one-off. And throughout all of this training, we're going to weave in some practical things to consider when thinking about or using ripple effects mapping. So the first bit then, when preparing for the workshop. The first point to note is on recruitment, who to invite and how many people to invite. Our experience would suggest that around 4 to 8 people could work well within one ripple effect mapping output at any one time. If you have more than 4 to 8 people, then they might not have the opportunity to fully contribute to that particular output or that particular conversation. However, the actual workshops themselves can accommodate many more people than this. If you have people contributing to, say, a couple of different ripple effect mapping outputs. So I've run these sessions in the past with up to 20 people, but it's likely that you could have more than this, say up to 30 people. It's also important to consider how much knowledge your participants have of the project that they are using ripple effect mapping for. So it seems to work better when each person is familiar with the work that each other has done. If no one knows each other or they don't know about the work of each other, then it can tend to lead to less productive conversations because their stories are very much and their accounts are very much separate from one another. What we want to do is see those stories and those narratives that people come with really sort of interdependent upon one another. So this then leads to the next point about facilitators. Ideally, it would be helpful to have at least one facilitator per group. So that's per ripple effect mapping output, sort of with 4 to 8 people. Now, it doesn't take long to train people in how to facilitate a session. And hopefully this training here might actually be sufficient just so they're familiar with the method and they're familiar also with what the focus and the content of these workshops looks like. But if they're familiar already with carrying out things like focus groups, then we feel quite confident that they would also be able to facilitate a ripple effect mapping session. And lastly, just in terms of the materials that you might need, it's sort of good old-fashioned flip charts or butcher paper, some post-it notes and some coloured pens that you're probably going to need for the session. That's if you're doing it in an in-person format. If you're using an online format, then an interactive whiteboard, such as Miro, will enable multiple people to contribute to the ripple effect mapping output simultaneously. Moving on now to the actual overview of what a workshop looks like. So a ripple effect mapping workshop takes the form of an interactive and participatory session, and they can last anywhere between 1.5 to 2.5 hours, depending on the group that you're working with and the time that you also have available. Now, the outline below will work for either an in-person or an online workshop. And really, there's sort of 5 main steps then to consider within one of these workshops. The first, and I'll go through all of these in the slides that are going to come hereafter, but the first element of the workshop is just some team-based conversations, which serves a bit of a warm-up, which I'll talk to in a moment. It's really the second and third bits of the session that require probably the most amount of time and the most amount of conversation from participants. So this is where they're actually mapping and drawing out the impacts, and they're also adding further detail to what they've drawn out on the ripple effect mapping outputs. And then the fourth and possibly the fifth stages, these are more reflective. So this is where we get participants in the workshop to reflect upon and identify the most and least significant impacts. And in that final aspect of the workshop, it's getting them to reflect on the utility and the usefulness of actually being part of that ripple effect mapping workshop, and whether or not it might have any implications for the work that they do in the future on their project or their particular piece of work. So if we go into the first step then of the workshop in a little bit more detail. Now the timings that we've put on these slides are just indicative, so we're suggesting that you might need 10 to 15 minutes for this particular step of the workshop, but again, very much dependent on how much time you have available to you. So this first step really serves to act as a warm-up or an energizing activity. So here you're asking people in groups of sort of 2 or 3. Really, the aim then is just for them to discuss their work with someone who might not be familiar with their particular piece of work. So there are several key questions here that you can focus in on, and elements of this are underpinned by appreciative inquiry for those of you who might be familiar with that. So some of the questions that you could ask people to ask one another is, what have you done that you were proud of? Did anything else kind of occur as a result of that particular piece of work that you're involved in? What was required in order to make that particular impact possible? And were there any unexpected or unanticipated impacts that arose that were associated with your work? Now at this sort of stage, we're not really writing anything down. As I say, it's just to get people talking to one another and to get into that space where they feel happy then to talk about and to start mapping out some of the things that might have happened as a product of the work that they've been involved in. So that's really, as I say, is a bit of a warm-up activity. It's quite easy for that to end up taking more time than is necessarily allocated. So you might want to be quite careful with just sort of facilitation and how much time you do actually allow for that, so that it doesn't detract from the rest of the session that you've got. The second step, in conjunction with the third one, are probably the main ones. So we want here to allocate maybe about 2/3 of the time of the workshop to these. In groups of 4 to 8 people, you're going to place a big piece of flip chart paper in the middle of the table. You can either do this before or you can ask participants within the session to draw a timeline on the flip chart which spans from the beginning of the project to 3 months from the present day. Then what we're going to ask people to do is to start writing down the things that they have done throughout the time span up until the present day. So what have they done and what are the impacts that they have seen that have occurred because of the things that they have done? And this might be your participant on their own, or it might be, say, several different participants within the ripple effect mapping workshop who've worked together on something. And it works very nicely when you get multiple people bouncing ideas and bouncing information off one another. Once they've got some of that just very quick initial information down in terms of the main activities that they've done, we can then start to ask questions along the lines of, well, were there any wider impacts or any other ripples associated with your work or the particular impact that you've noted down? And we can keep going. So you then really start building up a bigger picture of what's been done and what the implications of that have been. It's important to remember, especially when putting things on against the timeline, that we're only trying to estimate when things happened. It doesn't need to be very precise to the date, but it is useful further down the line from an analytical point of view, just so that we can get a sense of how long it takes for some of these things to happen within the particular projects that you might be interested in. Another thing to take into account is that we can kind of work both forwards and backwards. So historically, I've tried to promote the use of identifying actions and then what's happened as a product of that, so working forwards. But also what we might want to do is identify an impact and then say, well, what have we done that has led to that impact occurring? So you can work in this both forwards and backwards manner between both your activities and also the impacts that have occurred. So really, what we're trying to do at this step, step 2, is just get a bit of a feel for what's happened within the timeframes of your project. This is what just some really sort of simple examples look like, and they may look like this if they're done on paper. So you can see really clearly in the middle of that the timeline, and then the information above and below the timeline are some of the activities and the impact associated with a couple of different projects. We've also got, say, an example here from which Jen showed earlier on, from an online ripple effect mapping workshop. So this is an output from a virtual whiteboard called Miro, and as you can see, it can be really colourful, and those different colours within this output actually signify different things. So it works from a visual perspective just as well, both in an online and an in-person format. So looking now at the third step, and as I say, this can be done at the same time as step 2. Now really what step 3 is all about is having some further questions that can be asked of your participants, and also to enable therefore some further information to be put into the ripple effect mapping output. So some of these example questions that you might want to get people to start thinking about are things such as, who has been involved within these activities? So what are the organisations that have been involved? How many people might have been involved? If it's, say, I don't know, a physical activity initiative, like how many people may have been reached or influenced by that physical activity initiative? So we can start to get some sort of numbers in these outputs as well. Were there any financial impacts? Were any new funds brought in as a product of some of the work that's been done? A really, and I think this one is particularly good, a really useful kind of question to ask is, of all of those activities and impacts that you've started to map out, which of those were intended and planned, and which of those were unintended and just happened as a consequence of something else or something happening within the broader context? You can mark this by, I don't know, for something, if it's intended, you can just put an I next to it. If it's unintended, you could put UI next to it. But to try and make these sorts of differentiations can be quite powerful within the ripple effect mapping outputs. We can also ask what else is going on that might have an influence upon the impacts that you've noted. So here, COVID's a really good example, because we know that lots of other things might actually contribute towards, say, the thing that you're working towards as well. And the last one is worth spending some time on. And this is trying to get people to think about, what do they want to happen, or what do they anticipate is going to happen within the next 3 months of their project. And this is why I said before that it's useful to, within the timeline that you draw out, to include sort of 3 months from the present day on that timeline. So here, as I say, asking people to map out what do they expect is going to happen in the next 3 months. And if you then run follow-up sessions, what you can do is you can reflect back upon everything in that 3-month period and say, well, have things actually happened as we expected, as we anticipated they were going to happen? And that is a really helpful kind of approach to take from an analytical perspective. So these questions, if you wanted, could also be informed by a framework or a theoretical model, and this might be very much aligned with your particular research project. So these are just some suggestive additional questions that you might want to ask of participants and ask of their projects. So really you're encouraged here to tailor these questions to your specific project or evaluative needs. And I just wanted here to show you, like, very quickly, like what an output, and although this is digital, what an output might start to include. So this is drawing on some of the work that I was involved in a couple of years ago. So as you can see here, we've got a timeline that spans from July 2018 to February of 2019. So the time frame here isn't massive. What we do have though, so one of the things that was delivered within this time was an organisation brought lots of stakeholders and different organisations together in a bit of a one-off event. So there were 65 different organisations attended this sort of stakeholder workshop. And it's all about physical activity, this work as well, I should say. So one of the things that came out of this workshop was that within the local community, it was identified that women were a group who may particularly benefit from some form of an intervention. So these are several activities that we've put here on the ripple effect mapping output. On the back of identifying women as a group who might benefit, there were then 2 other workshops that were ran, separate workshops, that tried to explore locally what some of the barriers and the enablers might be that could encourage women to be able to be more physically active within their local area. On the back of these workshops that were run, there were a number of community residents who were really passionate about trying to provide more opportunities for physical activity for women in their local area. And so what these six attendees did is that they set up a local steering group, and this steering group then went on to meet on a monthly basis for about an 18-month time period, and it goes beyond the timeline here. But something else happened as a product of that second workshop that I talked about too, and this was that one of the barriers that was highlighted was that in the local leisure centre there was a lack of female lifeguards, which meant that Muslim women in particular didn't necessarily feel safe and comfortable going to the leisure facilities. And so members of the steering group met with the leisure provider to talk about this and to try and identify some possible solutions. And then the leisure provider went on to actually start offering some female-only sessions. So you can see here that we've got lots of activities and also some impacts now within this ripple effect mapping output. So that should just give you a bit of a feel for what one of those, at a very simple level, the type of information that can be included in there. Going back then to what the workshop actually looks like, the fourth step, as I said earlier on, is very much a reflective one. So this asks the group to identify in their output what they would consider to be the most and the least significant impacts. And this is a really useful step from a continuous improvement perspective, possibly here more so than an evaluative perspective, because it can be used to think through what could have been done differently in order to mitigate against some of those low impacts or the least significant impacts, however they define or see them. And similarly, they might be able to build on the strengths from talking through what they consider to be the most significant changes. So it's about the conversations that sit around these most and least significant changes that is really beneficial and potentially important to have between stakeholders who are participating in one of these sessions. And as an evaluator, you might wish to record these conversations, and also you might want to mark on your maps which impacts were viewed as the most and least significant. And the final stage of the workshop, which will kind of make the most of any remaining time that you've got, is really just to reflect from the stakeholder, the participant point of view, how the session went. And I think there's four main questions here to consider, and there might be some additional ones that you wanted to add in as well. So what was the main learning based on having mapped out your particular project and the impacts of your project? Is there a process, or sorry, is there a means of enhancing this ripple effect mapping process in the future? So here, from a methodological point of view, you're thinking, how can we tailor this better to the needs of our participants? Going back to their own project, is there anything that they would do differently within their work in the future following having taken part in, say, one of these sessions? And the last question is very much there based on the premise that you're going to run some follow-up sessions, is to ask, who else do you think would be useful to involve in one of the ripple effect mapping sessions? That, what I've talked about beforehand, was what one initial ripple effect mapping workshop would look like. One of the main recommendations that we made in the published article is that you run these ripple effect mapping sessions concurrent to the program being implemented. So we, in some of our projects, have used ripple effects mapping sessions every 3 to 4 months, and this worked really well. And the idea here within these follow-up workshops, and they're a little bit shorter in duration because you don't necessarily need to talk through what ripple effects mapping is and introduce it, etc. So we did them within about a 60 to 90 minute time frame. The idea is that you build upon the maps that have already been created. So having had one of those initial sessions, you might want to input that information. If it was done in a drawn out format, you might want to input that so it becomes electronic into some software so that you've got that digital copy. And then these digital copies can be printed out and updated on within the follow-up workshops. So many of the same steps apply as what I've previously talked about. However, as I say, given that people will now be a bit more familiar with the method, less time overall is required. And because we're only reflecting really on like what's happened in the time between the last session and say the present session, so that might only be a 3 to 4 month window of time, there might be less information that actually gets added into those ripple effect mapping workshops. So as a means of starting out in these follow-up workshops, what you can do if you've got the ripple effect mapping output on the table, you want to go and revisit all of the previous activities and impacts that we've already mapped out and ask the question, what has happened in the time since? So in that 3 to 4 month time period, what's actually happened? And this is really important because it prevents the outputs solely focusing on things that are going well. It asks people to go back to almost all the activities, and some of these activities may not have moved forward as they would have anticipated, or some of them might have ceased. You can also have a look at what you anticipated was going to happen. And then you can start asking the question, well, did this happen? If it didn't happen, what did happen? And we know that many programs and projects will have to adapt in response to other things that are going on. And again, think about like in the context of your own work, the impact that COVID will have had upon all of that. So we know that things don't necessarily always unfold as we might have anticipated. And quite often progress is a lot slower than we anticipated being as well. So before I bring this session to a close, we just wanted to show you how a ripple effect mapping output might build up over several sessions. You might recall this simple output that I talked through a few moments ago. Well, this was just one small element of a bigger ripple effect map. So if I start to show you this output here was what was produced within the first or our initial ripple effect mapping workshop. And this tried to capture the activities and the impacts that had occurred over a 9-month time span. What I've done here is I've highlighted all of the information that was included on that slide beforehand. So you can see that simple example I gave you before is part of this bigger ripple effect mapping output. So that's the kind of level of detail that was included here. We then go on to the second session 3 months later, and the output begins to build and get a little bit wider. We ran the third session 3 months later after that. So we've now got information across 15 months of the project. We keep going further. So the fourth session took us up to 18 months. And then this is the final output. So this was the 5th ripple effect mapping session, taking us all the way through to, I think, 21 months in total. Now, this was probably one of our most detailed outputs. But it's a really good example to demonstrate the level of detail that can actually be captured about a project or a program within a ripple effect mapping output. So we made all of our outputs here digital, and we did this using Vensim. Vensim is free to download and to use, but there is probably other software that is just equally as good. However, these outputs and being involved in the workshops can actually be very useful in itself. But what we're going to show you in the next video is, whilst the outputs are useful, as I say, in and of themselves, the next video is all about how we analyze these outputs once we have them created. So just to summarize here, the first thing to note is that we think it's important to try and invite a breadth of people who have been involved in your project to these ripple effect mapping workshops. And as we say, they can include between 4 people all the way through to maybe 30 people in one of these overall workshops. The workshops themselves are very much participatory, they're quite energizing, and they force people to reflect upon the work that they have done and also to think about the work that they hope to do in the coming, say, 3 to 6 months. What we have recommended, and it's one of the main adaptations that we made to the method, or we recommended within our paper, is that they should be carried out throughout the life course of an initiative, rather than just using them retrospectively at the end. And as I say, it did work well to run these for us every 3 to 4 months. And the outputs that come from the ripple effects maps can be quite complex, and this leads then into the next and final session, and they do then also require some systematic analysis. So thank you all very much for listening. Hopefully that did provide you with some more information above and beyond what's included in the paper. We very much welcome any feedback on this, and we are able to adapt these training videos over time. You've got our contact details there, and we hope that you are going to be able to join us in the third online session. Thank you.